I was wondering if you had any texts that were not Cisneros texts that you could pair with some of her readings. That's typically a common request from our teachers.
Yeah, a novelist that is Macondisa, isn't that a great name? Someone who was part of the Macondo workshop. A novelist that I really liked is a woman named, this is her real name, Reina Grande. And she has a memoir I'm putting in the chat right now
Thank
called
you.
The Distance Between Us. And she actually has a YA edition of this text. So Reina Grande was born in Mexico, was born in Iguala, and crossed with her father in the 1980s when she was about 9 years old. And this memoir talks about her experience as an undocumented person in California growing up, and becoming a citizen and becoming a college student and becoming a writer, and how this affected her and affected her family. It's a really powerful memoir. She has some good novels too, but I think The Distance Between Us is by far her strongest work and is one that students really relate to. One of my favorite parts of it, so she's growing up in the 80s and she talks about seeing the movie E.T. and how E.T. just wants to phone home and get home, and how that affected her as a child because she missed Mexico and she missed her grandmother in Mexico so much that that connection to this movie character really stood out from her. So it's one of those moments in the text that really think about what it means to grow up in two cultures in two different worlds. So she's one I would highly recommend. And then the other writer that I think you could pair well with this, in with the short stories, would be my UT colleague, Oscar Casares, and he has a short story collection called Brownsville that has some great short stories that um, work in similar ways in terms of diction and in terms of thinking about these issues of being between two worlds. So that's what I can suggest right now.
Those are great. Do you have any advice on how teachers can more seamlessly integrate discussions of diversity and just make it a more normal part of the conversation throughout the day rather than having it blocked and separated, like you mentioned?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think it is important to not block and separate it. So, I think pairing text, pairing diverse text with those that we might consider more canonical works. So, I often pair The House on Manga Street with Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own. They pair really well together because both authors are speaking to the importance of finding a place for oneself within a text and within a world that doesn't often create those places. So that's a really powerful link. And I tell my students that these might not be two writers that you think had similar experiences growing up, but when you read how they've had to view the world from a place of inaccessibility to education or opportunities, you can draw those comparisons. Um, the other way that I would think about doing that is always to develop units thematically. So, House on Manga Street is a novel about growing up. So, is Huckleberry Finn or To Kill a Mockingbird. Any of these work, these more traditionally taught um, novels that we get in middle school and high school can be linked thematically to some of Cisneros's work. Interesting. I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but House on Manga Street has been, there's talk back in January, which seems so many months ago, doesn't it? The TV producer writer, last name Gamont, who created the Narco series on Netflix, had gotten the rights to produce House on Manga Street as a TV show, as a series. So we'll see how that actually works out. But there is a play of it, that there's a theatrical production of House on Manga Street that I've seen it run both in Austin and San Antonio, so that can always be something to look out for too.
Isn't there a film as well? I think I remember watching it back when I was in school.
Not that I'm aware of a film related on it. Maybe a film
Just a bunch of
production.
trailers.
Yeah, I've not seen one, but that would be interesting to
Odds are I was looking for one when I was reading it to help me get.
probably probably so. But you know, some interesting films to think about kind of related to this. Um, there's a great one, I want to say it's like from 2012, maybe a little bit later, called um, A Better Life is the film that I'm thinking about. And that would pair really well with Grande's The Distance Between Us because it speaks to the idea of immigration and the American dream, right? So that would pair, and it's set in California, so that would pair really well with Steinbeck. I always try to think about ways to take what, you know, we're used to teaching in the classroom and how we can bring in new text. Yeah, and Crystal's comment about trauma. That's a really good question about this text. So at the end of the novel, our main character Esperanza experiences a sexual assault. She's not specific on exactly what happens, and she does that purposely. She says that in the letter because she wanted, I mean, in Hydra House, she wanted people to be able to understand that at the level that they were willing to. But that is a really question about the teaching of something traumatic like that. And it's something that I've been thinking about ways to do it. What I do know is that you have to talk about it. I've had students tell me, we read that novel in high school. We didn't even talk about that chapter, which is problematic because then it says we don't talk about those things. And it is really important to your development. So, what I often do is one, I let students know that before we read. I think it's important, and I hate the phrase trigger warning, but I think it's important to let them know, hey, this is going to happen, so that if a student is affected by it, you can prepare that student for it, and you can also set up those guidelines around the conversation. I think with that chapter, I would speak specifically about how vague she is in explaining what actually happened because what's more important is the effect that it had on her. And in that chapter, when she's describing the incident, she keeps going back to the phrase, don't make me talk about it. I don't want to tell the story. And so to talk about how that is such a contrast to what the novel has to say about the need to tell the story, the need to share this. And so why Cisneros would choose to write it, and how talking about it and sharing it becomes a way, again, to lead to some understanding and maybe possibly healing of it. So there's a lot out there. There's a lot starting to be written on ways to teach trauma. But I think the most important thing is to acknowledge it and to prepare students with ways in which to talk about it.
I think that's great advice. Thank you. We have run out of time for the Q&A, so now we're going to move on.